All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to Live from Currituck Extension. My name is Adam Formella. I'm the county's agriculture extension agent. And on today's episode, we're going to go over starting a garden. We're going to talk about how to plant a garden. It's April, but it's not too late to start a garden. Really, we're in a great time. There's a lot of things now that it seems like the weather has warmed up. We're getting a little bit less rain. So now is really the perfect time to start to prepare your garden and get things in the ground. So we're going to go over that today. But before we do that, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat and I'll answer them as we go along. We're adding Facebook now. This is our second day. I'm not really sure how that works, but hopefully y'all can ask questions too if you're watching it there. I know you can ask questions if you're watching it on our YouTube stream. And if you're watching this recorded, well, none of that matters. You can shoot me an email. You'll find my email on our website, and the link to that is in the description. While you're there, take a look at all of our links. We've got them for our social media. And so you can see what we're doing around the county. We've got one for our evaluation, and that's really helpful. We use that to change up the content based on what y'all would like to see. And then we also have links to a lot of the publications that I'm going to talk about today. So if you're watching this and maybe you aren't going to remember this information, you can pull those up, download them, print them, whatever you want to do. And so you'll have that. But one of those publications or one of those links goes to this, and this is a little bit of talking about some of the classes I'm doing. This Week in the Garden is a new series I'm starting where I started, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago. Anyways, every Friday I'm going to be posting videos and articles where I follow my garden from the beginning, planting all the way through to harvest. And so we'll have a lot of trial and error, and you'll be able to see what it's like, because I give a lot of these recommendations. What does it look like when you go and do that in a garden? So if things don't turn out quite the way you'd like, well, it happens to all of us. So that's what that series is going to be about. I think the premise is really that the best way to learn is through failure. But I think it's even better to learn through somebody else's failure. And so hopefully y'all will be able to learn through my failures as we go through this garden experience. So enough of that. We're going to get on to the subject for today, starting a garden. And we have these 3 points. We're going to talk about planting a garden. And there are 3 big questions that come with that. Answering those questions will hopefully get you prepared to start preparing for planting. The next step, where you'll prep your soil, you'll get your plants, and you get the row spacings, all that. And then we'll talk about planting date. Of course, we'll stop at each one of these sections. So if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat. I'll answer them live. Of course, if you are watching this recorded, shoot me an email and I'll answer those as well. So we're going to start by preparing for planting. The 3 big questions are really, what do you like to eat? How much do you want to grow? And how much do you want to spend? Now, that seems really oversimplified. There's a lot of other things you can think about, like, well, put your garden close to a water source. And that's really a convenient thing. There's a lot of little convenience things that can help to make your garden be a little bit more successful, a little bit more manageable and kind of fun to do. But these 3 are the big ones that will help you be successful in the long term. And my thought when I was putting these down was that you really struggle with your garden in the late summer months. So once we get into July and August, it gets to be 100 degrees. No one wants to go outside. What can you do now to prepare for that? And these 3 questions, I think, are really the ones that should help guide you to get you ready for those hot summer months. So first, what do you want to eat? Well, you should really only be planting what you want to eat. And that's a problem a lot of people have. They go to the big box stores, whether it's Lowe's, Home Depot, that kind of thing, and they see something like a purple pepper. And they're like, well, that's cool. I want to plant a bunch of those. And that's great if you like peppers. You know, a purple pepper probably isn't that much different than something that's red. But if you don't like peppers, don't try to grow something that's different thinking you're going to like it. And I guess along that same note, don't grow a bunch of eggplant thinking, I'm going to learn to like to eat eggplant. That's not going to work well in your garden. And this is really why, because when you start to grow things you're not going to like to eat, you don't really care for those plants. So you don't care about caring for them. You end up getting diseases, weeds, insects all around those plants. And the problem with a vegetable garden is once you have them on one plant, they spread everywhere. So a lot of your diseases can spread to multiple plants. A lot of insects will feed on all kinds of vegetables. So there's some that'll feed on peppers. Then they'll feed on tomatoes, your beans, your corn. They'll feed on everything. So the most important thing is plant the things you want to eat. If you're excited about the things in your garden, you're going to go and care for them more. And that's really important when it gets hot in the summer and you don't want to be outside for an hour weeding your garden or picking off insects, that kind of thing. So that's question one. Question two is, how much do you want to grow? And sometimes people will start a garden and say, I've got this much land and I'm going to plant whatever I want in there and fill it up. And that's great, especially if your space isn't huge. But a lot of first-time gardeners will find an area in their yard that's enormous, and they'll say, I'm going to plant it full of vegetables. And then you've got a ton of vegetables and you get a weedy mess in the summer because you can't take care of it. So the best thing to do is to start early and plan how much food you want to grow for your family. If there's just 2 of you, maybe you don't need a huge garden, and so you can plan accordingly. Or if there's 4 people, maybe you want a really large garden because you're going to be eating from it all summer long. So this is really an important step to make sure that you're sustainable. You have enough area that you can control to keep down those weeds, to keep down the insects. But once you've done this, it decides the size of your garden. And once you've got the size figured out, you can figure out where to put it in your yard. And that's an important step in planting your garden. And the last thing is probably the most important thing, but doesn't get talked about a lot, and that's setting a budget. Gardens can get expensive. Usually people garden to save some money. They like the taste of fresh vegetables. They like the challenge of growing their own vegetables. But it can get out of hand pretty quickly if you don't plan a budget. So this is just an example of a budget. This is more for a flower garden. But there are things you need to consider. Overall, when you're planting a garden, the cheapest way to do it is to just dig some holes in the ground and plant some seeds. That's how I did my garden this past year. I tilled up the soil and I planted a bunch of plants. And generally that's cheap because your only input is the tools you need to till it up, the seeds or the plants that you're going to transplant, and then you need water and fertilizer, that kind of thing. As you start to want to spend more money, maybe you want a nicer looking garden, you can do container gardens. They have added input for things like the container you're putting it in, the planted pots, the soil, that sort of thing. And then a step above that is a raised bed. And there's a lot of pros for doing gardens in a raised bed, but they have added costs because you have to make that raised bed, whether that's out of wood or stone or brick, that kind of thing. And then you have a lot of soil to add to those. So make sure that you know how much money you want to spend on your garden beforehand. And that'll also help to determine what type of garden you're going to have and help to determine your size as well. So with those 3 things in mind, knowing what you want to eat, how much you want to grow, and how much you can spend, it'll determine the size of your garden, what you're going to be growing, and then the location you can put it in your yard. So that's really the most important thing when you're planning your garden, is those 3 questions. Now, before we move on, we're going to take a quick break to see if anybody has any questions. If you're watching this live, you can type them down now. And if this is recorded, you can shoot me an email and I'll try to answer those. I'll try to get back to you as quick as I can. But it looks like, looking at our chat, we don't have anybody asking any questions. So we're going to move on to the next part where we're going to talk about preparing for planting. And these are the things that you're going to be doing before you start to plant your garden. I recommend to do these about a week before you plant. That'll give your soil a little time to settle, but also it'll keep you from rushing. And so my example there is, when I started my garden this year, I was preparing the location, tilling up the soil, and doing all of that. I started it early in the morning. It took me just about all day, and I was rushing to plant my plants. And then it started to rain, and I had a big mess on my hands. I had seeds going everywhere, didn't have good germination. So you want to prepare for your planting about a week before you actually want to start planting. And that includes prepping your soil, picking the appropriate plants, and your row and your seed spacings. So the first thing we're talking about is soil prep. What do you need to do to your soil now that you have your location figured out? And I've tried to show 2 different types of soils that are common in our area. These pictures aren't from Currituck though, so you'll find like rocks and stuff in there, and that's fine. But the picture on the left is sandy soils, and we've got a lot of those. And then the one on the right, at least for me, is heavy clay soil, and we've got some of those in the area too. Now your sandy soils are going to drain really quickly, and your clay soils are going to hold on to moisture for a long period of time. And so once you've tilled up the ground and you kind of have an idea of what type of soil you need, or you have, you're going to want to amend it with some kind of organic material. You can add topsoil into that, or you can add something like compost. And they sell bags of this at the box stores, or you can get it delivered, depending on how big your garden is. But this helps the texture of your soil. So if it's sandy, it adds a little bit more substance to it to hold on to that water. If it's a heavy clay soil, it helps to break those clumps of clay up And that helps you with your water, because you don't want too much water where your plant's roots are going to drown. You don't want too little where your seeds, once they start to come up, they run out of water. So that's a really important step, is getting the right texture of the soil. And then you'll want to make sure that your soil is nice and level in your garden while you're tilling it along. And you can be doing that when you add the third step, and that's fertilizer. Fertilizer is important because it's really the building blocks of your plants. So your plants get sugar from photosynthesis. They get that energy from the sun, but they need their nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium from the soil. And so if you have a garden that you haven't added fertilizer in a while, you might need to add some fertilizer. Or if it's a new garden and you've never added any fertilizer in that part of your yard. So normally we recommend you to take a soil sample every 2 years of your garden, and you just take that sample, you give it to us, and we send it off, and they analyze it for free if it's between April and Thanksgiving. So that's a really great service that we can provide for you. If you need any help taking the soil sample, we've got videos on our YouTube channel on how to do that. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, we're not able to do that at this time. So the lab is shut down. So the general rule, if you didn't test your soil already this year, is to put about 2 to 3 pounds of a 10-10-10 fertilizer per 100 square foot. Now, a 10-10-10 fertilizer has 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 10% potassium. If you can't find that, you can reduce the amount. If you find maybe a 20-20-20, you can use a little bit less fertilizer. Just know that that's what you're shooting for, is those 3 nutrients at that rate. So that's what you're looking for when you're fertilizing, and then you can mix that in to your garden, and that'll help you. Again, you want fine soil, but you want that fertilizer mixed throughout. And when you're tilling your soil, you're preparing it, you want to prepare it for about 6 to 10 inches. The deeper you can get it prepared, the better, because those roots of those plants can go down 2 to 3 feet. So depending on the type of plant, they can really go down deep ways. So just want to make sure that you're preparing your soil properly. That will give you better success in the long term. Now we're going to talk about your seed and your plant selection. Now, there are certain plants that grow better when you start them as seeds, and there's others that grow better when you start them as transplants. The things that grow better as seeds are things like your sweet corn, and then a lot of your beans grow better when you just start them as seeds in the ground. Now I have this slide up here, and it's got some corn seed, and then on the other 2 sides, the red and the green or blue, whatever color that is. Those are treated seeds. They've been treated with a fungicide. And the reason I have this slide up is because a lot of people like to start a garden early. I'm one of those people. I wanted to push my garden as early as I could. The problem is when you start to plant early, you have issues with cold weather. It's cold on the plants above ground. In the ground, it's cold as well. It's usually really wet and rainy outside. And so you have issues with disease. And so really your seed doesn't matter when you're planting it throughout most of the year. It doesn't matter if it's treated or not treated, whatever you prefer. But if you're planting really early into early March or early April, you may want to think about putting down a seed that has a fungicide on it. And that will just help you when you have diseases in the soil. It'll help you deal with that wet temperature, because germination can be an issue when you plant early. Other than that, planting seeds is a great way to go. It's a little bit cheaper than transplants, so it can help you on the budget side. And then they usually give you more seeds than you would ever need. So you can plant a couple of seeds per little area, and that way you get something to come up. When we're talking about transplants, they are really great for things like tomatoes and peppers that take a long period of time to grow. You can buy them at stores, or you can start them yourself, and we've got a video on that as well. So you can check out our YouTube channel for, I think it's called Starting Transplants or something like that. But you'll see me there, and I talk about how to do transplants. The big thing with transplants is when you bring them outside, you want to make sure that they're hardened off. And what that means is that you're acclimating them to the outside weather. So they've been inside, they've been sheltered. When you take them outside, you want to slowly introduce them to the weather, add a couple hours each day over the course of a week, and that'll really help your plants grow well. And then with both of these, whether it's a transplant or a seed, make sure that you water it for about 2 weeks, whether that's when you planted that seed or whether you transplanted your tomato, your pepper, whatever it is. That'll give them a better chance of surviving, because they won't have issues, that additional stress of water. So that's an important step when you're talking about your plants. The last thing we're going to talk about when you're preparing your site is your rows. The general rule is to plant your rows running north to south. That gives you the best chance at sunlight. So the plants aren't competing quite as much for that. That really depends though. That's just kind of a general rule. What a lot of people do too is they plant their rows depending on the elevation of their yard. So if you have drainage issues, you want your alleys to go so it can drain into a central area. So for my yard, I have a big ditch behind my garden, and so the ditch runs like this, and all my alleys go this way, and so that the water can drain into that ditch. If you had it the other way and your alleys ran this way, they would have to go all the way around, and you'd end up with pooling in the middle of your garden. So that's an important thing when we're talking about orientation. When we talk about spacing, I have this picture up there because it's kind of a weedy mess of a garden. Row spacing is important. The general rule, if you want them to be uniform, is to put your alleys 18 to 24 inches apart. But that can be more or less depending on the vegetable and what type of gardening you want to do. So if you're growing something like pumpkins or watermelon, they need about 4 feet between the plants. And so we'll talk a little bit about plant spacing in the next slide. I don't want to get too much into it now, but plant spacing is important because you want the plants to have plenty of room for air to go in between the plants. If the plants are really close together like this, it'll be dark, it'll be humid, so you'll have insects in there and you'll have an opportunity for diseases to grow in there. So that's the most important thing when you're putting plants close together. That you can put them really close together and prune them and you won't have an issue. Just know that that is a possibility. On the other hand, if you put them too far apart, you really won't have much issues aside from maybe a couple more weeds to pull. But row spacing varies from plant to plant. So we'll talk about that in the next thing. And really the alleys, about 1.5 to 2 feet is all you need for that. So I'm going to take a quick break now, and we're going to talk about my favorite publication next. But I'm going to look at some questions in the chat. If you have any, type them down now or send me an email. Oh, so we do have a question. I'll try to pull it up here. So this is from Facebook, from Cameron Lowe. And she says, what is a reasonable budget for a small garden? A lot of it depends on the things that you already have and what you're looking to spend. And what do you mean by a small garden? So tomato plants are anywhere between $5 for a 6-pack, or they can be cheaper than that. So if you just want a couple of tomatoes, you can spend about $20 and you can get quite a few tomatoes. Seeds are about $1.50 a piece. So really, if all you have is a shovel that you need to buy, you can spend maybe $20 on a shovel, maybe $50 on your plants, and then you just have to water. So whatever your water bill is. So you can garden relatively cheap, under $100. And I have a relatively large garden in my backyard. My rows are about 15 foot long, and it's about 100 feet across. So I've got about 1,000 to 1,500 square foot garden. But I did it in a cheap way. I have a tiller, so that was my cost there, which is a little over $100. I had about $100 or $200 in fencing to keep my dogs out. And then I spent about $50 to $60 on plants. And those are really my only inputs for my garden. So even on a large garden, you can do it relatively cheaply. Now, when you start to do something like a raised bed, your price goes way up because you have things like a 4x4 or some type of post to keep all of your stuff in. And then you have the soil as well. And then you have to water it somehow. So your things can get up, but you can even start small gardens for under $100 relatively cheaply. Or you can start your container gardens on your porch for under $50. So hopefully that answers the question without getting too much into details. We're going to move on now because I don't see any other questions. And we're going to talk hopefully about my favorite publication. This is my favorite one. This is just one little picture of it, but this is the Eastern North Carolina Planting Guide. It's specific to this part of the state, but if you're in the central part or the western part of North Carolina, we've got one for each of those areas. And I'll kind of walk you through this, but on the far, well, at least for me, it's on the far left. I don't know if it is for y'all. They have the different types of vegetables. So you can see those, and it starts all the way at A with things like asparagus and goes down to turnips. And then it has the days to harvest. And so that's a really great thing to know. It's just a general rule, so your different varieties might be a little different. But it's a great way to start planning your garden because you can say, all right, tomatoes take about 80 days before they'll start getting fruit. So if you have a vacation in July, you can start to plan out, all right, I should plant my tomatoes here, or I should plant my corn on this day. So that's a really great thing to consider when you're planning your garden. And it also tells you in the next column the distance between the plants. And this is, again, general rules. Some people will grow really intense gardens. You can put your plants really close together for those, but generally you want things like your tomatoes to be 18 inches apart. And so that's great there to figure out your spacing between your plants. But the most helpful thing is the planting calendar. And that's the bulk of what you'll see where it says January, and then on our screen all the way through September. I think this goes through to even December. So it does all 12 months, and then it breaks it down by a half month. So it goes from January 1st, and then January 15th, and then February 1st, all the way through. And it tells you what to plant your plants as. So the S is a seed, the T is a transplant, and the TU is a tuber if you're planting potatoes or things like that. But it's a great guide to tell you about when you should start planting. You can always try to put it a little bit earlier. And I did that this year, but it seems like I didn't have much luck doing that. So I would recommend to stay in that calendar if you can. Shoot for the middle of those, and that's where you have the best luck. But like I said, you can push them one way or the other and see if you can grow anything. But this is a great way to plan out when you're going to plant your garden. Or like me, I have a big garden and I don't want to plant it all at once. So I'm tilling up some sections and then planting the early stuff and then going on and keep tilling and planting. So that's kind of how I've planned my garden. But this is, like I said, my favorite publication for figuring out where to plant things, figuring out the distances, when to plant them, all that stuff. So if you have any questions about that, how to use this tool, you can ask them, send me an email. We don't have any questions in the chat. So with that, we're going to start to wrap up today. If you could, please fill out our evaluation. It's only a few questions. I think it's maybe 5. And it really helps us to change our programs to be stuff that you all want to see. And also in our description, we have the link, like I said, for This Week in the Garden, the new series I'm starting. The new video will come out this Friday, and then we'll post a giveaway. This week's giveaway is going to be seeds. So now that you all know how to plan your garden, how to prepare your garden, we're going to do a giveaway for seeds. So check out that this week on Friday to see more information about the giveaway and to learn more about gardening. But that's all we have today from Live from Currituck Extension. And thank you for tuning in and watching, and make sure that you stay tuned in tomorrow at 11:30 where we'll be doing yoga with Olivia.